Being a police officer in a small town has its perks and its drawbacks. On one hand, you know everyone and everyone knows you. But on the other hand, it means you're the first to hear about every odd occurrence, every whispered rumor that circulates through the community. Most of the time it's nothing, just local gossip or harmless misunderstandings. But every so often you get a weird call. This is one of those calls. The call came in on a crisp autumn afternoon. I was sitting in my patrol car, sipping on a lukewarm cup of coffee, when the radio crackled to life. The dispatcher's voice was calm, almost indifferent, as she relayed the details. A hiker had reported seeing an old man in the woods just outside of town, acting strangely. The hiker described him as disoriented, wandering aimlessly and muttering to himself. It didn't sound like much, but in a town like ours, like even a minor incident could lead to something more serious. The woods weren't far from the old state highway, a place where people occasionally got lost or injured. I figured it was worth checking out, if only to ensure the man was all right, and to bring him back to town if he needed help. I radioed back that I'd take the call and started the drive out to the woods. The road was narrow and winding, lined with towering trees that seemed to close in around me as I drove deeper into the forest. The leaves had turned shades of red, orange, and gold, carpeting the ground in a blanket of color. It was the kind of scene that people come from miles around to see, but today it felt different. Darker, more foreboding. As I reached the trailhead where the hiker had last seen the man, I parked the car and got out, taking in the stillness of the woods. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant calls of birds. I grabbed my flashlight, even though it was still daylight, and started down the trail. The trail was narrow, with trees so close together that they blocked out much of the sunlight. I walked slowly, scanning the area for any sign of the old man. The deeper I went, the more I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. The usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, squirrels rustling in the leaves, were absent. It was as if the entire woods were holding their breath. After about 20 minutes of walking, I noticed something off to the side of the trail. A faint path, barely visible, leading deeper into the woods. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. The ground overgrown with weeds and fallen branches. But something about it caught my attention, a gut feeling that this was the way to go. I turned onto the path and followed it as it wound its way deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to grow taller and denser, their branches interlocking overhead, blocking out the light. The air grew cooler, the shadows lengthening as the sun dipped lower in the sky. And then I saw him. He was standing just off the path, his back to me, staring at something in the distance. He was tall and thin, his clothes old and worn, hanging loosely on his frail frame. His hair was white and unkempt, falling around his shoulders like a tangled curtain. From where I stood, I could hear him muttering to himself, his voice low and raspy. "Sir?" I called out, trying to keep my voice calm and non-threatening. He didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge my presence. He just kept staring into the distance, his hands clasped in front of him, his head slightly tilted as if he was listening to something only he could hear. I took a step closer, my hand resting on my radio. "Sir, are you all right? Do you need help?" Again, no response. I was close enough now to see that his clothes were covered in dirt and leaves, as if he'd been out here for days, maybe even weeks. His skin was pale, almost gray, and there was a strange smell in the air, like damp earth and decay. "Sir?" I tried again, taking another step forward, and that's when he turned around. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets, and his skin was stretched tight over his skull, giving him a skeletal appearance. But it was his eyes that sent a jolt of fear through me, pale and glassy like those of a dead fish, staring at me without any hint of recognition or emotion. For a moment, we just stood there, staring at each other. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. There was something deeply wrong with this man, something that went beyond simple disorientation or confusion. He turned and started walking away, moving with a strange, stiff gait that made my skin crawl. I hesitated, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to follow him, to try to help him, but another part of me, the part that was screaming at me to get out of there, kept me rooted to the spot. I watched him disappear into the trees, his figure fading into the shadows until he was completely out of sight. The forest seemed to swallow him whole, the silence pressing in around me like a physical weight. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind struggling to process what I'd just seen. My training told me to follow him, to make sure he was okay. My instincts were telling me to leave, to get out of the woods as fast as I could. But before I could make a decision, I heard something, a rustling sound, coming from the direction the old man had gone. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it quickly grew louder, closer, until it was right on top of me. I turned, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, the shadows, and the thick underbrush. But the sound was still there, moving through the woods, circling me, growing louder with each passing second. My heart was racing, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my radio. I had to call for backup, had to get someone out here with me. But just as I reached for the radio, the sound stopped, the woods falling silent once again. And then I felt it, a presence, right behind me, so close I could feel its breath on the back of my neck. I whipped around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the empty trail, stretching out into the shadows. But I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel it, something watching me, something waiting just out of sight. My instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but my feet felt like they were rooted to the ground. I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe. All I could do was stand there, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with fear. And then I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the shadows just beyond the edge of my flashlight's beam. It was a sound I'd never heard before, a sound that sent a jolt of terror through my body. I took a step back, my hand reaching for my gun, but before I could draw it, the growl grew louder, more insistent. It was coming closer, whatever it was, closing in on me, trapping me in its invisible grasp. The sun had nearly set by now, the forest bathed in the dim light of twilight. The shadows were long, the trees towering over me like silent sentinels. I was alone, miles from the nearest house, the nearest road. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the wind and that low, ominous growl echoing through the trees. I forced myself to move, my legs heavy as I took a step back, then another. The growl followed me, growing louder, closer, until it was all I could hear, drowning out everything else. I broke into a run, my boots pounding against the ground as I sprinted back down the trail. The branches whipped against my face, the underbrush snagging at my clothes. But I didn't stop, didn't look back. All I could think about was getting out, getting back to my car, getting away from whatever was out there. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in around me, the shadows growing darker, deeper. I could still hear the growl following me, chasing me, a relentless predator hunting its prey. Finally, I burst out of the woods, the trailhead coming into view. My patrol car parked just where I'd left it. I didn't stop, didn't slow down until I was inside. The door slammed shut behind me. It wasn't until I was back in town, the bright lights of the streets coming into view, that I finally allowed myself to breathe, to let go of the fear that had gripped me so tightly. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, something that wasn't supposed to be. I still think about that night, still wonder what was really out there in the woods. And every time I drive past the trailhead, I feel a chill run down my spine, a cold reminder of the fear I felt that day. And sometimes, when you venture too far into the unknown, you might find more than you bargained for. You might find something that was waiting for you all along. I've handled more than my fair share of break-ins and home invasions over the years. Most of the time, it's straightforward. An open window, a forced door, a stolen TV. But every now and then, you get a call that sticks with you. One that makes you question everything you think you know about safety and security. This story is about one of those calls. It started as a routine check, but it quickly spiraled into something much more terrifying. A night that still sends shivers down my spine whenever I think about it. It was a warm summer night, one of those evenings where the air is thick and heavy and the sun takes its time setting. I was just about to wrap up my shift when the call came in. A woman in her mid-30s had reported hearing strange noises in her house. She was alone, scared, and convinced that someone had broken in. My first thought was that it was just another case of paranoia. People get jumpy when they're by themselves at night, but something in her voice made me pause. There was a tremor, a note of genuine fear that I couldn't ignore. I responded to the call and made my way to her address. A small, tidy house in a quiet, suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where nothing ever happens. For her, the biggest excitement is the annual block party. The street was lined with neat lawns and white picket fences, each house almost identical to the next. But as I pulled up in front of her house, I noticed that it was the only one with the lights still on. Every window was ablaze with light, as if she was trying to keep the darkness at bay. I parked the car and approached the front door, my hand resting on my holster. I knocked, calling out her name, and after a moment, the door creaked open. The woman stood there, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She was dressed in a bathrobe, her hair tousled as if she'd been woken up suddenly. "Officer, thank you for coming," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but I keep hearing these noises. I swear, someone's in my house." I gave her a reassuring smile, even though my gut told me something was off. "Don't worry, ma'am. I'm here to help. Let's check it out together." She led me inside, and I immediately noticed how spotless everything was. The house was immaculate, no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, nothing out of place. But the air was thick with tension, like the calm before a storm. She guided me through the living room and into the hallway, her hands wringing the edge of her bathrobe. "I was in bed, trying to sleep," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. But then I heard it. This scratching noise, like something moving around. At first I thought it was just the wind or maybe the house settling, but then it got louder. It sounded like it was coming from under the bed. I could see the fear in her eyes, the way her whole body seemed to tremble as she spoke. "Have you checked under the bed?" I asked, already knowing the answer. She shook her head quickly. "No, I was too scared. I locked myself in the bathroom and called you." I nodded, trying to keep my own nerves in check. "Okay, let's go take a look. I'm sure it's nothing, but it's better to be safe." We headed down the hallway, the floorboards creaking under our feet. We reached her bedroom, and she hesitated at the door, her hand gripping the doorknob so tightly her knuckles were white. I could see the fear in her eyes, the way she seemed to brace herself for whatever might be inside. I took a deep breath and gently pushed the door open. The room was exactly what you'd expect. A neatly made bed, a nightstand with a lamp, a dresser against the wall. But there was something off about it, something that set my nerves on edge. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to gather in the corners, or the way the air felt heavy and oppressive. Whatever it was, it made my skin crawl. I stepped into the room, the floor creaking under my weight, and slowly made my way to the bed. The woman hovered in the doorway, watching me with wide, anxious eyes. "Stay there," I told her softly, and she nodded, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the doorframe. I knelt down beside the bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the cool draft from the open window behind me, the curtains rustling softly in the breeze. I reached out and lifted the bedspread, shining my flashlight into the darkness underneath. At first I didn't see anything, just dust bunnies and old shoes, the usual forgotten things that accumulate under a bed. But then, just as I was about to dismiss it, I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible rustling, like something shifting in the shadows. My breath caught in my throat, and I inched the flashlight closer, trying to see what had made the noise. And then I saw it, a pair of eyes, wide and staring, reflecting the light back at me. My heart stopped. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was stare at those eyes, unblinking, unfeeling, watching me from the darkness. I pulled back instinctively, my mind racing. What the hell was under there? My hand went to my holster, my fingers trembling as I gripped the handle of my gun. I had to stay calm, had to think this through, but the fear was overwhelming, clawing at my throat, making it hard to breathe. "Ma'am," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I need you to step back, slowly. Someone is under the bed." Her eyes widened in terror, but she didn't move, frozen in place by fear. I didn't blame her. I felt the same cold dread creeping up my spine, the same paralyzing terror. But I had to stay focused, had to protect her. I stood up slowly, keeping my eyes on the bed, my hands still on my gun. "Whoever you are, come out slowly," I ordered, my voice firmer now, more authoritative. But there was no response. Just that same eerie silence, broken only by the faint rustling beneath the bed. I took a step back, trying to keep my movements calm and deliberate. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do next. I couldn't just leave her there, couldn't just walk away. But I also couldn't ignore the very real possibility that there was a dangerous intruder hiding just feet away from us. I glanced at the woman, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Go to the living room," I whispered, now. She nodded quickly, her feet finally moving as she backed out of the room, her hands still clutching the doorframe. I watched her go, the sound of her footsteps fading as she hurried down the hallway. Now it was just me and the intruder. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears it almost drowned out everything else. I couldn't just wait, couldn't just stand there doing nothing. I had to act. I knelt back down, gripping the edge of the bed frame, and yanked the bed away from the wall, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. And there he was, a man, thin and wiry, with wild eyes and matted hair, curled up in the fetal position under the bed. His clothes were filthy, torn, his skin covered in grime. But it was his eyes that struck me the most, wide, unblinking, staring up at me with a mixture of fear and madness. He didn't move, didn't say a word, just kept staring at me with those wild, crazed eyes. I could see his chest rising and falling rapidly, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He looked like a cornered animal, ready to lash out at any moment. "Come out slowly," I ordered again, my voice as calm as I could manage. But he didn't move, didn't react. It was as if he was in a trance, completely disconnected from reality. I had to get him out of there, had to end this without anyone getting hurt. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. I couldn't just drag him out. He might lash out, might have a weapon. I needed to de-escalate, to keep things under control. "Hey," I said softly, lowering my gun slightly. "It's okay, you're not in trouble. Just come out and we can talk, all right?" For a moment, I thought it might work. His eyes flickered, his gaze shifting slightly, as if he was trying to comprehend what I was saying. But then, in an instant, his expression changed. His face twisted into a snarl, and he lunged at me, his hands clawing at the air. I barely had time to react, stumbling back as he scrambled out from under the bed, his movements frantic and wild. He charged at me, his arms flailing, his mouth open in a silent scream. I fired a shot into the floor, the loud crack echoing through the room, and he stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes wide with shock. For a split second, we just stared at each other, the air between us thick with tension. Then, without warning, he bolted, running past me and out of the room, racked his footsteps, pounding down the hallway. I heard the front door slam open, the sound of him running into the night. I stood there, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart still racing. It was over. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that this wasn't just a simple break-in. The woman was in the living room, sitting on the couch, her hands trembling as she clutched a pillow to her chest. She looked up at me, with wide tear-filled eyes, her face pale and drawn. Is he gone?" she whispered. I nodded, trying to offer her a reassuring smile. "He's gone. You're safe now." But even as I said the words, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't true, that there was something more to this. The way he'd looked at me, the way he'd hidden under the bed, it wasn't just fear or desperation. There was something else in his eyes, something I couldn't explain. I took a deep breath, trying to push the thoughts away. I'd done my job, I'd kept her safe. That was all that mattered. But as I left her house, the night air cool against my skin, I couldn't stop thinking about those eyes, the way they'd stared up at me from the darkness. And I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just hiding from us, that he was hiding from something else, something far worse. In the days that followed, I tried to put it behind me, to move on, but the memory of that night, of those eyes, lingered in the back of my mind, a shadow that wouldn't go away. I spoke to other officers, asked if they'd ever experienced anything like it. Most of them shrugged it off, chalking it up to stress, to the unpredictable nature of the job. But a few of them, the ones who'd been on the force for years, gave me knowing looks, their expressions serious. "There are things out there," one of them said, his voice low and somber. "Sometimes we get a glimpse of them, just for a moment. And when we do, it's best not to ask too many questions." I didn't press the matter, didn't push for answers, but the words stayed with me, echoing in my mind every time I thought about that night, about the man under the bed. And every time I go to bed, every time I hear a noise in the dark, I can't help but check under the bed just to make sure. There's a certain routine you develop as a police officer, a rhythm to the work that over time becomes second nature. You respond to calls, assess situations, and deal with whatever comes your way. Most nights it's the usual: domestic disputes, traffic stops, the occasional petty theft. But every once in a while, you get a call that shakes you to your core, a call that breaks the rhythm and leaves you questioning everything you thought you knew. This is one of those calls, a night I still can't fully explain, and one that has left me with more questions than answers. It was one of those nights where the air felt thick, almost oppressive, like a storm was about to break. I was nearing the end of my shift, looking forward to getting home and unwinding after a long day. The streets were quiet, the usual buzz of activity replaced by an eerie stillness. I was cruising down a deserted road when the call came in. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio, informing me of a 911 call from an elderly woman who lived alone in an old house far from downtown. The report was vague, something about a woman in her house acting strangely, refusing to leave. The dispatcher didn't have many details, just that the woman seemed frightened and insisted she needed help. I sighed, turning my car in the direction of the address. It sounded like a routine welfare check, maybe a case of dementia or confusion. But I had a job to do, so I responded and headed to the scene. The house was easy enough to find, a small weathered structure set back from the road, surrounded by overgrown trees and bushes. It looked like it had been there for centuries, the paint peeling, the windows clouded with dirt. A single porch light flickered weakly, casting long, wavering shadows across the front yard. I pulled into the driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires, and stepped out of the car. The air was thick with the scent of rain and earth, the kind of smell that signals an impending storm. As I approached the front door, I noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar, hanging open just enough for a sliver of light to escape from inside. I paused, my hand hovering over the handle of my flashlight, a sudden unease settling in my gut. It wasn't unusual for people to leave their doors unlocked in this part of town, but something about this felt wrong. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The interior of the house was dimly lit, the light coming from an old lamp in the corner of the living room. The place had the musty smell of disuse, the air heavy and stale. I called out, announcing my presence, but there was no response. Just the sound of the wind rustling the trees outside and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight, and began to make my way through the house. It was a small, cluttered place, filled with old furniture and knickknacks, the kind you'd expect to find in a home that hadn't been updated in years. The living room led into a narrow hallway, lined with family photos that looked decades old. As I moved deeper into the house, the unease I'd felt earlier began to intensify, a cold knot forming in the pit of my stomach. I reached the end of the hallway and found myself standing in front of a closed door. The air was colder here, the light dimmer, as if the very atmosphere was trying to push me back. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Something about this door, this room, felt wrong, like it was holding something back, something that shouldn't be disturbed. But I had a job to do, so I took a deep breath, turned the knob, and pushed the door open. The room beyond was small and dark, lit only by the faint glow of a single lamp on a bedside table. The bed was unmade, the sheets rumpled and stained, as if someone had been lying there for days. And in the corner of the room, huddled on the floor, was the woman who had made the call. She was old, maybe in her late 70s, with thin, white hair that fell in tangled strands around her face. She was wearing a nightgown that was too big for her frail frame, the fabric hanging loosely around her thin shoulders. Her eyes were wide and bloodshot, staring at me with a mixture of fear and desperation. "Ma'am, "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping closer. But she didn't respond, didn't move. She just stared at me, her eyes unblinking, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "Ma'am," I repeated, my voice softer this time, trying to coax her out of whatever state she was in. Then, without warning, she began to scoot toward me. It was a slow, jerky movement, like she was being pulled by invisible strings. She didn't use her hands or legs, just her back, her body dragging across the floor in an unnatural way. Her eyes never left mine, wide and unblinking, as she scooted closer and closer. There was something horribly wrong about the way she moved, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I instinctively stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. I called out to her again, but she didn't respond, just kept coming, inching closer with that horrible jerky motion. It was like watching a puppet on a string, her movements mechanical and devoid of life. "Stay back," I warned, my hand hovering over my holster. But she didn't stop. She just kept coming, her eyes wide and vacant, her mouth slightly open, as if she was trying to speak but couldn't find the words. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was she having some kind of seizure, a stroke? But no, this was something different, something far more sinister. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the shadows lengthening and twisting in the corners, as if the very house was alive, watching. Suddenly, the woman stopped. She was only a few feet away from me now, her face pale and ghostly in the dim light, her head tilted to the side, her eyes still locked onto mine, and then she spoke. "They're here," she whispered, her voice raspy and broken. "They've come for me." A chill ran down my spine, the words sending a wave of fear through my body. I didn't know what she meant, didn't understand who or what they were, but the terror in her voice was unmistakable. "Who's here, ma'am?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. But she didn't answer. Instead, she let out a low, keening wail, a sound that sent shivers down my spine. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated fear, the kind of fear that comes from knowing something terrible is about to happen, something you can't escape. And then she lunged at me. It happened so fast I barely had time to react. One moment she was on the floor, and the next she was on her feet, her hands clawing at my uniform, her eyes wild and frantic. I stumbled back, trying to push her away, but she was surprisingly strong for her frail frame. Her nails dug into my skin, her breath hot and foul against my face. "Get them out!" she screamed, her voice high-pitched and desperate. "Get them out of my house!" I finally managed to shove her back, and she fell to the floor, crumpling into a heap. She lay there, sobbing, her body shaking with each ragged breath. I stood there, panting, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but there was no time to process. Because at that moment I heard it, a soft shuffling sound coming from the hallway. I turned, my hand instinctively going to my weapon, and I saw them. At first I thought it was just shadows, tricks of the light playing on my tired mind, but as I stared down the dark hallway, I realized they were real. Figures, pale and indistinct, moving toward me in the darkness. There were 3 of them, their forms vague and shrouded in shadow, but I could see enough to know they weren't human. They were tall, thin, their limbs too long, their movements jerky and unnatural, just like the woman's had been. They moved slowly, deliberately, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, fixed on me. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling, but they didn't respond. They just kept coming, their shapes becoming more defined as they drew closer. I could see their faces now, elongated, featureless, their mouths twisted into grotesque, silent screams. The woman behind me let out another wail, and I realized with a jolt of terror that these were the they she had spoken of. These were the things she had been so afraid of, the things that had come for her, and now they were coming for me. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the house as I bolted for the front door. I could hear them behind me, their shuffling footsteps growing louder, closer. The air was thick with the scent of decay, of something rotten and old, something that had been buried and forgotten. I burst through the front door, the cold night air hitting me. I didn't stop, didn't look back, just kept running until I reached my patrol car. I jumped inside, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get the car started. Finally, the engine roared to life and I floored the gas, the tires screeching as I sped away from the house. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the lights of the town finally coming into view. Only then did I pull over, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my hands still trembling. I called it in, told dispatch what had happened, but I left out the details, the figures, the woman's strange behavior, the things she had said. I knew they wouldn't believe me, that they'd chalk it up to exhaustion or stress. Hell, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something real, something that defied explanation. I could still hear that woman's wail in my ears, still see those figures moving toward me in the darkness, their eyes glowing faintly, their mouths twisted into silent screams. The house was abandoned after that night, left to rot and decay, just another forgotten place on the outskirts of town. I never went back, never tried to find out what had really happened there. Some things are better left unknown, better left in the darkness where they belong. The scooting woman was just the beginning of a nightmare that I'll never forget, a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. The things I saw that night, the things that came for her, they're still out there, just beyond the edge of the light. And if you're ever unlucky enough to encounter them, you'll know what real fear is. Because some things can't be explained, can't be understood, they just are. And that's the scariest thing of all. As a police officer, you get used to the noise, the bustle, the unpredictable nature of people and their troubles. But every so often, you come across something that shakes you to your core, something that doesn't fit into the neat little boxes you've built for the world. It was a quiet, overcast afternoon when the call came in, the kind of day where the sky is a flat, gray blanket and everything feels muffled, like the world is holding its breath. I was at the station, wrapping up some paperwork when the dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. A young boy, 8 years old, had been reported missing by his mother. She'd last seen him playing in their front yard, and now he was gone without a trace. I felt a familiar knot of concern in my stomach as I grabbed my gear and headed out. Missing kids were always a priority, and time was of the essence. The boy's house was in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town, bordered by a thick expanse of woods that stretched for miles. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something about this call was different, something that didn't sit right with me. I pulled up to the house, a small place with a neatly manicured lawn. The mother was waiting on the porch, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. She was wringing her hands, her whole body tense with fear. "Officer, thank you for coming," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, you have to find him. He's never run off like this before." I nodded, giving her a reassuring smile. "We'll do everything we can to find him, ma'am. Can you tell me exactly what happened?" She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "He was playing in the yard right there," she said, pointing to a small patch of grass near the fence. "I was inside just for a minute, getting him some water. When I came back out, he was gone. I looked everywhere, called his name, but he didn't answer. He's never gone into the woods alone. He knows better." I followed her gaze to the edge of the yard, where the fence ended and the woods began. The trees were tall and dense, their branches intertwining overhead, casting long shadows across the ground. The entrance to the woods was marked by a narrow, well-worn path, the kind kids might use to explore or play games of make-believe. "Did you check the woods?" I asked, already knowing the answer. She shook her head quickly. "No, I didn't want to go in there alone. I thought maybe he'd just wandered off, that he'd come back if I waited. But he didn't. I radioed for backup, requesting additional units to help with the search, and then turned back to the mother. "We'll start by searching the woods. If he's in there, we'll find him." She nodded, her eyes wide with worry. "Please, find him." I gave her a reassuring nod and set off toward the path, my flashlight in hand, even though it was still daylight. The woods were thick, the trees towering overhead, their branches forming a dense canopy that blocked out much of the light. The ground was soft and uneven, covered in a thick layer of fallen leaves and underbrush. As I walked, I called out the boy's name, my voice echoing through the trees. But there was no response, just the sound of the wind rustling the leaves and the distant calls of birds. I kept moving, my eyes scanning the ground for any sign of him, a footprint, a piece of clothing, anything. The deeper I went, the more the unease in my gut grew. The woods were too quiet, too still, as if the very air was holding its breath. I've spent plenty of time in the woods before, but there was something different about this place, something that made my skin crawl. After what felt like hours of searching, I finally spotted something. A small, worn sneaker, half buried in the leaves. My heart leaped into my throat as I hurried over, picking it up. It was a child's shoe, the kind that could easily belong to an 8-year-old boy. "Over here." I called out to the other officers who had joined the search, my voice strained with urgency. They came running, their faces grim as they took in the sight of the shoe. We fanned out, searching the area with renewed intensity, but there was no sign of the boy. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air, leaving nothing behind but that single solitary shoe. The day wore on, the shadows growing longer as the sun dipped lower in the sky. We combed through the woods, calling his name, searching every inch of ground, but it was no use. The boy was gone, and no one had any answers. I returned to the house as dusk began to settle, my heart heavy with the weight of failure. The mother was sitting on the porch, her hands trembling as she clutched a blanket around her shoulders. When she saw me, her eyes filled with tears, and I didn't have the heart to tell her what I knew deep down, that we weren't going to find him. Not today, maybe not ever. "We'll keep looking," I told her, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "We'll bring in more officers, search teams, dogs. We won't stop until we find him." She nodded, but I could see the despair in her eyes, the way her hope was slipping away bit by bit. "Thank you, officer. Please, please find my boy." I left her there on the porch, her sobs echoing in the stillness of the evening, and headed back to my car. But as I reached for the door handle, I noticed something strange. A faint sound coming from the direction of the woods. It was so soft I almost missed it, but when I stopped to listen, I heard it clearly, a distant echoing call, like a child's voice. My blood ran cold. It was his voice, I was sure of it. But it didn't sound right, it didn't sound natural. It was distorted, almost mechanical, like a recording played on a loop. "Help me." The words sent a shiver down my spine, freezing me in place. The sound was coming from deep in the woods, far beyond where we'd searched. I knew I should call for backup, should wait for the others to arrive. But something compelled me to move, to follow that voice. I grabbed my flashlight and headed back toward the trail, the beam cutting through the growing darkness. The trees loomed overhead, their branches twisting together like gnarled fingers, blocking out what little light remained. The voice called out again, closer now, but still distant, as if it was leading me deeper into the forest. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to find that boy, had to bring him home. The path grew narrower, the trees closing in around me until I could barely see the sky through the thick canopy of leaves. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing in on me from all sides, making my skin crawl. I shone my flashlight around, trying to get my bearings, but the beam only revealed more of the same. Endless trees, endless darkness. I took a step forward, and that's when I saw it. Something small and pale just at the edge of my light. My breath caught in my throat as I moved closer, the beam revealing more and more of the figure. It was the boy. He was standing there, barefoot, his clothes torn and dirty, his eyes wide and empty. But there was something wrong, something deeply unsettling about the way he looked, the way he stood so still, so unnatural. "Hey, buddy," I said softly, trying to keep my voice calm. "Are you okay? Let's get you out of here, all right?" But he didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me with those empty eyes, his face expressionless. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "It's okay, I'm here to help. Let's go back to your mom, she's waiting for you." But still, he didn't move. And that's when I realized he wasn't really looking at me. He was looking past me, into the darkness behind me. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and I slowly turned, shining my flashlight into the shadows. At first, I saw nothing, just trees and darkness. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of something. Something moving. Something watching. I turned back to the boy, but he was gone, vanished into the night without a sound. Panic surged through me as I called out his name, but there was no response. just the echo of my own voice, swallowed by the darkness. I tried to retrace my steps, tried to find the path back to the house, but everything looked the same. Every tree, every shadow. I was lost, trapped in the endless maze of the forest, with no way out. The night had fully descended now, the darkness absolute. The only sound was the pounding of my heart, the rush of blood in my ears. And then, just as I was beginning to lose hope, I heard it again, that voice, calling out from the darkness. Help. Me. It was the boy's voice, but it was different now, distorted, twisted, like a recording played backward. The sound sent chills down my spine, my mind racing with fear. I knew I should run, should get out of there, but I couldn't move, couldn't think. All I could do was stand there, frozen in place as the voice grew louder, closer. I turned, slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. And that's when I saw it, a figure, standing just at the edge of my light. It was the boy, or at least it looked like him, but there was something wrong, something deeply unsettling. His eyes were empty, hollow, his face pale and expressionless. He was standing perfectly still, staring at me with those empty eyes as if waiting for something. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. But he didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at me, his mouth slightly open, as if he was about to speak. And then slowly, he raised his hand, pointing past me, into the darkness. I turned, following his gaze, and that's when I saw it, a shadow, moving through the trees, coming closer, faster. My heart leaped into my throat as I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering as I tried to get a better look. But the shadow was gone, vanished into the night as quickly as it had appeared. I turned back to the boy, but he was gone too, leaving me alone in the darkness, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I ran, my footsteps echoing through the trees as I searched for a way out, for any sign of the path back to the house. But the woods seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. Finally, I broke through the trees, stumbling out onto the road, my chest heaving with exertion. I could see the lights of the house in the distance, a beacon of safety in the darkness. But as I reached the house, I stopped, my heart skipping a beat. My mother was still sitting on the porch, her eyes wide with fear, but she wasn't looking at me. She was looking past me, into the darkness of the woods. And then slowly, she raised her hand, pointing toward the trees. I didn't look back, I couldn't. I just grabbed her hand and led her inside, locking the door behind us. We waited there, in the darkness, listening for any sound, any sign of movement outside, but there was nothing, just the silence, thick and oppressive, pressing in on us from all sides. I never saw the boy again, never found out what happened to him, but I know he's still out there, somewhere in those woods. And sometimes, when the night is quiet and the wind is still, I can still hear that voice, calling out from the darkness, echoing through the trees. Help me. But I know better now. I know it's not really him. It's something else, something that's been waiting in the shadows for a long time. And it's still waiting. The vanishing boy was more than just a missing person. It was a glimpse into something darker, something that defies explanation. The fear I felt that day, the way those woods seemed to come alive with shadows and whispers, it's something I'll never forget. If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't forget to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new tale that's sure to keep you up at night. Stay safe, stay curious, and remember, the truth is often scarier than fiction. Until next time, keep the lights on.